Dr. Wakefield really doesn't need an introduction, so I think what I'm going to do is skip that and just let's welcome Dr. Andrew Wakefield.
Thank you very much. It's wonderful to be back here again. Kristen is irresistible. Certainly from the number of phone calls she makes insisting that I come. It's a great pleasure always to be here. Two things happen when you fly from Miami to Utah. The first is you lose your voice, and the second is your nose runs. And so you should never get up on the stage and speak without a box of tissues, which is exactly what I've done. So if I need tissues, I'm going to call on you to deliver them. A banquet of consequences. Who said that? Your starter this morning. Who talked about a banquet of consequences? No, it's unfair. I'm going to leave it till the end to tell you. Here, as you know, is the common narrative. Anti-vaxxers are spreading false claims as people die of measles. Measles is the rod, really, that is being used to beat the public with in terms of forcing mandatory vaccination upon you state by state. Here's another one. Stephen Salzberg. The anti-vaccine movement causes the worst whooping cough epidemic in 70 years. Thank you so much. This is another rod that is being used to beat the public. So is this narrative true or not? Let's explore some of the history of that. And to understand why we are where we are right now, why the mandates are so aggressive, why the actions of public health and the pharmaceutical industry are to force vaccination upon us, to punish doctors who offer exemptions, to take away medical exemptions, from vulnerable children, the most vulnerable children, to go worldwide, to go globally with this agenda, and to plan to link mandatory vaccination from the womb to the grave, to your ability to function in society. If you don't know it, there is an experiment taking place in Argentina right now, where everything you do publicly is linked to your vaccination status. If you, on your personal identifier, which each person has in Argentina, if you have not been fully vaccinated as an adult, then you cannot get a driver's license, you can't travel, you can't fly, you can't go to a football game, you simply cannot function in public. And this is the way, this is the plan for the world. So let's go back and explore the origins of this problem and try and understand the co-evolution of man and microbe, how we came to the place that we find ourselves at now, and how we have failed to accord these extraordinary microorganisms the respect they deserve. They accuse you of not taking measles seriously. And let me make the case very clear during this talk that it is them who have not taken it seriously. It's a question of perception, and this was the perception of one of the great vaccinologists, Louis Pasteur, in France, talking about microbes in general before the distinction between bacteria and viruses was available. If it is a terrifying thought that life is at the mercy of the multiplication of these minute bodies, it is a consoling hope that science will not always remain powerless before such enemies. So the perception at the time is that microbes, infectious agents, whatever they may be, were the enemy. They were the enemy to be defeated. We now live in the era of the microbiome. We now know that our very existence on this planet, that our health is dependent upon the health and quality of the bacteria that colonize our gut and our skin and elsewhere, that we would not be alive without them, that it is a symbiosis. But 100 years ago, they were perceived as the enemy, and we did everything we could to obliterate them at huge cost. And some of you who came last year will recognize elements of this talk, and the reason that I'm giving this talk in an adapted form again is that it created a model last time. It predicted, based upon my understanding of measles, so after many, many years of research, where we were going in the future. And within a very short space of time, we have got there. And so many of the predictions in that model have sadly come to pass, and I want to share those with you. Now, let's go back to my own alma mater, St. Mary's Hospital. 3rd of September 1928, Alexander Fleming, returning from his vacation, noted that Petri dishes in which he was culturing Staphylococcus were failing to grow the bacteria. There were mold contaminants within the Petri dishes that were inhibiting the growth of the Staphylococcus. And this was the beginning of the discovery of penicillin. Pasteur said, in the fields of observation, chance favors only the prepared mind. And it was the prepared mind of Alexander Fleming that made this observation and turned this observation into a medical miracle. The medical miracle, this is the language they used at the time, that antibiotics were a medical miracle, and indeed at the time they were. They transformed the natural history of, for example, battlefield gangrene or neurosyphilis or scarlet fever. These diseases became virtually unheard of or eminently treatable in the face of antibiotics. But in a very short space of time, in less than 100 years, it turned into a nightmare. Bacterial resistance, principally due to the inability of the antibiotics, the imperfection of the antibiotics, the inability to kill 100% of the bacteria, but to allow certain elements of those bacteria to persist because they were resistant and become the new super dominant strain of the bacteria that was resistant to the antibiotic and highly dangerous, became a problem. And this is described in the words of public health authorities. This is their rhetoric, not mine, as the antibiotic apocalypse. So we've gone from miracle to apocalypse in less than 100 years. Subtotal kill was the major problem. And what that did was to put evolutionary selection pressures on the bacteria that drove it towards resistance, multi-resistance. And there are other things that contributed to this. Clearly, the inappropriate use of antibiotics by pediatricians, for example, or general practitioners saying, oh, your kid's got a pink eardrum, we're going to put them on amoxil. 3 weeks later, oh, it's not better, so we're going to put them on double the dose of amoxil or change the antibiotic. And there was the greed of the industry saying we want to put more and more powerful antibiotics into first-line therapy. And so it went on, and so it went on. And then we used in animal husbandry antibiotics ad libitum and drove the development of, for example, resistant E. coli and salmonella. All of these things created a selection pressure upon these microbes to mutate, and they are experts at mutation. They are experts at survival, and that's what they did. And now it's estimated that 50,000 people a year die from infections that antibiotics have lost the power to treat. And this is the most recent report from the World Health Organization. New report calls for urgent action to avert antimicrobial resistance crisis. We are in a crisis situation that we have created. That we have created because we did not accord these microorganisms the respect that they deserved. Not you, but those in the industry, those who were responsible for administering them. They thought they knew better. In their infinite wisdom and their arrogance, they got it completely and utterly wrong. Should we trust these people? Should we trust their views and opinions when they created this ecological disaster? The end of modern medicine. So are vaccines destined for the same fate? Is there any reason that they shouldn't be destined for the same fate? And that's the question we'll explore here. And I want to talk about measles because I've studied measles since 1990 and I know something about it. In 1954, measles was first isolated at Harvard by John Enders. It was isolated from an 11-year-old boy, David Edmonston, and so the name attached to the vaccine strain of the virus is the Edmonston strain. They first of all developed the Edmonston B strain, which was used in clinical trials. And the Edmonston B strain was so reactive, it produced so many adverse events that it had to be given with immunoglobulin at the same time. So purified antibodies that were then delivered into the other arm from the injection. Now, clearly that was impractical and unaffordable at a public health level, and that reactive vaccine was banned or stopped in this country. But it wasn't stopped worldwide. It was taken down to Central South America to experiment on the Yanomami Indians who'd never been exposed to measles before to see what the effects might be. So it was injected into these Yanomami Indians who had no immunity whatsoever. They were what's called a virgin soil population, and it killed thousands of them. Did we ever get to learn about that experiment? No. These are the people with whom you are dealing. It was also tested in places like Willowbrook School in Staten Island, a state hospital for children with severe mental retardation, as it was described at the time. So these children were expendable to the system. And they were easily observed because they could not move from their beds due to paralysis, brain damage. So they were easy to experiment on, and experiment they did. And for hepatitis B vaccine, they would give them unpurified fecal extracts by mouth from children who had hepatitis B. This is the integrity and the morality of those who advised us on the merits of vaccination. So in 1961, there was a meeting at the National Institutes of Health for the first time to discuss whether we should introduce universal measles vaccination. JFK, under advisement from Langmuir at the CDC, wrote that measles was a formidable and widespread threat. Was it? We need to discuss that. Sir Graham Wilson was an invited guest from the UK, and he was one of the world's authorities on microbes. He'd written the definitive text on this subject, and he was far more cautious. And he described measles as one of the inevitable, relatively unimportant maladies of childhood. In England, he said, and I dare say the US, 1 in 100,000 children dies from measles. In Scandinavia, this was 1 in 1,000,000. In other words, they had achieved in Scandinavia universal infection with the eradication of death. And his comment was, what is the real burden of this disease? What is it about the child, the single child who dies? What is different about them? And surely we should study that rather than entertaining the idea of mass vaccination of everybody to protect that one child. Wouldn't it be better to protect that one child by understanding what it was that made them vulnerable and correct that? A very, very wise response, but it didn't appeal to those who wanted to emulate the apparent success of polio vaccine, who were looking to have their name in lights at the end of their career. For those who wanted to make a great deal of money out of vaccination. It didn't do anything for those people. And so the vaccinologists won the day. Even Enders himself said a measles vaccine is only desirable if it confers the immunity that is comparable to that afforded by the natural disease. And we'll discuss that because that is so, so important. That once you've had the disease as a child, you are protected for life. Your immune system is set up in such a way that when you encounter measles in the future, you deal with it and it does not infect you. It does not establish infection and you do not suffer. And that is lifelong. And that is an extraordinary quality about measles that the vaccine had to emulate, and if it didn't, if it only worked for a certain length of time and made you susceptible to measles again as an adult, then that could be disastrous. And the vaccinologists won based upon these assurances, these promises to their colleagues and to the public, that there would be protection of the great majority of children from a single shot, that vaccine immunity would be lifelong, that there would be no injury, brain damage, or death, that measles would be quickly eradicated. Not just eradicated in fact, but rapidly eradicated from the world. The vaccine virus could not be shed from one individual to another, from someone who's been vaccinated to a susceptible individual, so-called horizontal transmission, and that there would be no need for mandatory vaccination. And the current dilemma. The current dilemma is that measles vaccine is causing disease, and that is being falsely used to leverage mandates. Just to give you an example, that in the year of the Disneyland outbreak, 2015, then there were, I think, just about 190 cases that they studied across America. And we may come to a slide on this in a moment, but 4 years later, a paper was published where they sequenced those viruses. They could determine the difference between the vaccine strain genetic sequence and the natural virus. They did it at the time. The paper did not appear reporting that until 4 years later. And when they did report that finding, they showed that 39% of the isolates of measles from measles cases in the US that year were vaccine strain. The vaccine had caused nearly half of the cases of measles. But the language at the time of the Disneyland outbreak, when these data were available but kept secret, and the language that was used in the media and to push mandatory vaccination in California, is that this was measles due to the anti-vaxxers, that this is the natural measles that is coming about because people were refusing vaccination. That was the language that was used to force the legislation through to get mandatory vaccination, knowing at the time, as they did, that nearly half the cases were caused by the vaccine. And they knew that if they told the legislators that the vaccine was virtually no better than the natural disease, then they would never have got the legislation through. Those are the people with whom we're dealing. Measles vaccine is not protecting against natural or vaccine-induced disease, and that blame is falsely being ascribed to people like you, the vaccine risk aware. And measles vaccination has destroyed natural herd immunity. Now, if I want to do one thing today, because this is the rod that's being used to beat you, we must preserve herd immunity. I want you to try and understand, and you will understand, and we talked about this before and we'll talk about it again, and I'll keep saying it until you're able to go into your legislator's office and describe to him what natural herd immunity, what the arguments really are. This is such an important concept, natural herd immunity. And it's driven the emergence of vaccine-resistant virus strains, just like antibiotics drove the emergence of the resistant bacteria. So here we have that paper. During the measles outbreak in California 2015, a large number of suspected cases occurred in recent vaccinees. Of 194 measles cases, 73 were vaccine sequences, unpublished data. For 4 years, they kept this secret from everybody. So, it has been a gross deception. Mandating vaccination is a public health intervention, and if the vaccine virus was detected in 2015, why was no one told for 4 years? We now know, and from this paper, and I'm just going to show you some examples of how we get horizontal transmission, how that other element of the promises that were made in 1961 by the vaccinologists came to be flawed. Here we have a case, New York City, a multiply vaccinated individual transmitting the viral vaccine to other susceptible individuals who had themselves, in many cases, been vaccinated, were unprotected. So yes, horizontal transmission of vaccine strain measles virus is a reality. So vaccine failure is not simply an inconvenience. If a vaccine fails and makes you susceptible to a disease again later in life, it becomes more dangerous. Measles is a more dangerous disease in adults than it is in children. Mumps is a more dangerous disease in adults than it is in children. As a post-pubertal male, you can get testicular inflammation and sterility, whereas it's a trivial disease in children. Chickenpox is a worse disease in adults than it is in children. It is safest to get these diseases as children when they are trivial and when we develop lifelong immunity. And so you have these two periods in life of susceptibility to an adverse outcome from measles, for example. Under one, intuitively because your immune system is not developed to the extent that it can deal with the infection adequately, and as an adult. And so it is safest to get measles as a child, and we will come to that. So bad vaccines are not just an inconvenience, they make the diseases more dangerous. Herd immunity. And we come to man and the coevolution with measles. I want to talk first of all about natural herd immunity and then vaccine-era herd immunity, whatever that might be. Natural herd immunity did not operate to stop infection, to prevent infection. Natural herd immunity, when we all got measles before the 1960s, operated to encourage infection, but to do so at an age when the disease was less serious, in childhood, and to avoid infection in those other periods when we were more susceptible to an adverse outcome in infancy and in adulthood. And it acted at the population level to produce a level of immunity across the herd that protected people who were more vulnerable to the infection. For example, adults and babies. And we'll describe how that happened. This is what happened to measles mortality in developed countries. This is the UK, show you exactly the same graph for the US, where data were kept. And up until 1920, measles was a major killer of infants during epidemics. 1,200 per million children were dying during epidemics, and beyond that there was this extraordinary fall in the case fatality rate, many, many years before the vaccine ever came to market. This was nothing to do with man's intervention, nothing whatsoever to do with the public health or doctors. This had nothing to do with it. There had been a 99.96% reduction in case fatality rate before the vaccine was introduced. And because death is the worst end of the severity of the disease, you can take this graph as a very good proxy for the severity of measles. Measles was becoming a milder and milder and milder disease in a very short time frame. Now, there are many reasons for this, and we could explore those, but we don't have time today. But this is natural herd immunity. This decline in the case fatality rate and the severity of measles was a consequence of natural herd immunity, is an extraordinary effect, an extraordinarily powerful effect that no vaccine could ever emulate. This was natural herd immunity. The first question, let me just go back, the first question as a scientist is, what would have happened if we'd never vaccinated? What would have happened to that curve if we'd never intervened with vaccination? Of course, we'll never know because we did, but it would have very, very likely decayed to zero. That is what is likely with it. We don't know because we had to interfere. The key elements to natural herd immunity. Single exposure produces lifelong immunity. Passive maternal immunity is absolutely essential. Transplacental passage of immunity from the pregnant mother to her fetus, and breastfeeding of a woman, a mother who has had natural measles herself, is able to protect the child, the infant, during that critical first year of life, until such time as they can develop their own immunity. There was an article just the other day, you must have seen it. This is a measure of the madness in the world, that they're trying now to stop people describing breastfeeding as natural. Because it interferes with the efficacy, they believe, of their vaccines, which are more natural. Really? That breastfeeding is not natural. What madness has possessed the world? This is the World Health Organization. So, this is a graph of the percentage of number of cases of measles historically. Very few in infancy, the great majority in childhood, and very few in adulthood. This was natural herd immunity, and I call this passive constraint, where the effects of natural exposure tend to constrain the age to childhood when it's most safe. So, this is the consequence of natural herd immunity. One is that you get measles as a child. When children first come together, they congregate, they're susceptible. It's the first time you get a huge pool of susceptible individuals coming together where they can rapidly spread this contagion by intimate contact, playing in the playground, at school together, in the classroom. It's the perfect place for a virus like measles to spread. That's why we see the great majority of cases in children. And the advantage of that is that one exposure then leads to lifelong immunity. So that one exposure protects you from later exposure as an adult. That constrains it to childhood. And at the other end of the spectrum is that the mother who's had natural measles has good transplacental immunity, good breast milk immunity that protects the infant. And so you have this natural constraint of age of exposure to childhood when it is less serious. Does that make sense? This is the way in which natural herd immunity operates to constrain the age of measles to childhood, to protect the infants, to protect the adults. Then the vaccine era. Let's go back to those assurances of protection of the great majority from a single shot, lifelong immunity, no permanent damage or death, quick eradication, wouldn't be shared, no need for... Which one of these promises has come to pass? Not a single one. Not a single one. Do we trust? Should we trust the people who gave us these promises in the first place? Should we trust those who gave us the promises about antibiotics, the miracle? Have these people accorded measles the respect it deserves? Absolutely not. Absolutely not. So what is this new model in the postmodern world, the modern world being the era of vaccination? That we have a profound disturbance in the coevolution of man and measles, and that altered measles immunity has arisen with deficient measles immunity in the population. And the case that I will make is that we are now coming to emulate the Yanomami Indians back in the Orinoco Basin, who had never experienced measles before until man introduced it for experimental purposes. That we are becoming a virgin soil population who, if we are now exposed to a strain of measles that is highly pathogenic, how will we respond? Can we respond? Can those people who've had natural measles respond? Can those people who've been vaccinated respond? Are we protected from this disaster, this potential disaster that we have created? And I say we. And what I mean, of course, is the industry and public health. The new model predicts widespread vaccine failure, change in age of measles with altered outcome, and the emergence of resistant measles mutants that are not susceptible to vaccine-induced immunity. And I'll try and illustrate that. Here we have the vaccine failure. This is an extraordinary study. What needs to happen is that intravenous immunoglobulin is purified from blood donors, and it's used to be given to people who have primary immunodeficiencies, genetic immunodeficiencies that mean they can't have the live viral vaccine. So if there's a measles outbreak, then they're given intravenous immunoglobulin with antibodies in against measles that protect them against measles. That's the theory. Okay, so the people making this product realized that over time they could no longer meet the FDA's requirements for the potency of the measles protection in there. That their donors who had been vaccinated were not giving them the antibodies they needed to meet the FDA's criteria for this product. It was failing. And so what they did is they said, right, can we correct this situation by giving them a booster dose of MMR just before we take their blood donation? Can we increase their antibody level to then hit the target required by the FDA? The answer was absolutely not. It completely failed. It doubled the antibody level but came nowhere near what was necessary to maintain, to protect, to get across, to meet the FDA's requirements. And within 100 days, that immunity was lost. It was back to baseline. In other words, you would have needed 3 boosters a year for life of measles vaccine to be anywhere close to what was required. I mean, that is a farcical situation when we were told that 1 dose would last for life. Really? So, this is one of the most worrying graphs I have ever seen. These are birth cohorts. People born here at this end of the graph in 1938 to 57, people who got natural measles, and at the end, those who were in the era, born in the era of not only one vaccine, but the booster vaccination. And those vertical dotted lines are when single measles vaccine came in, or the one shot, and then the booster dose, the dotted line to the right. So what we have here are the protective antibodies, what are called the neutralizing antibodies against measles. The antibodies in your blood that bind to the measles virus and stop it infecting the cells. What you can see is those who donated blood, who had been around in the era of natural measles infection and will inevitably have caught it, had very high levels of protective antibody. And now, where are we? Over on the left, there is no protection whatsoever. This is a terrifying graph because this tells the truth about what's going on. There is no protection. In the adult population, the blood donor population, in this study, there is 0 protection despite booster doses of the vaccine. This graph is utterly terrifying. That we here in America are a virgin soil population because of man's intervention. Vaccine failure, the second part of the model, is associated with a shift in the age of measles vaccination. This is a paper from Korea. The vaccine was available in '64. This is a summary of the paper at the bottom. There was a resurgence of measles 2004, 13, 14, and most affected were not children, but under 1 year of age and between 13 to 24. So there is this shift away from the mean age of measles, which is around 4 to 7. It's being displaced out to those who are more vulnerable to severe disease. And this number of measles susceptibles is accumulating over time. The title of their paper, Measles Strikes Back. Here is an outbreak in Serbia. And this, don't worry about the graph and the details, this just is a breakdown of age of exposure, but the important thing is those who are over 30, who are now getting the infection. If you look at epidemics in the left here in 2007 and epidemics of measles in 2018, then there is a shift. Those over 30 getting measles goes from 10% to over 50%. So vaccination has shifted the age of measles to those who are more vulnerable to severe disease, and those are the ones who we're going to see the reports of death in. This is not due to you. It's not due to people not vaccinating. It's not due to those who are cautious about vaccination. This is a consequence of vaccination policy. We have displaced the age of measles to those who are most susceptible, and we will now see deaths as a consequence of measles precisely because of vaccination, not because of you. Vaccination has destroyed natural herd immunity. Passive maternal immunity. Mothers who got natural measles gave excellent passive immunity to their babies. Mothers who are vaccinated do not. So babies born to mothers who have been vaccinated are no longer protected against measles under the age of 1. So if measles comes back and infects infants who have a greater chance of death or serious outcome, it's not your fault. It's the fault of the people who misunderstood, misrepresented this virus in the first place. This is extremely important to understand. And here is a paper from France, Kinetics of Decline of Maternal Measles Virus Neutralizing Antibodies in France. And it shows what they describe as a dramatic decline in the protection of infants under 1 as a consequence of vaccines. Boosters. There, once again, is the effect of boosters. 0. Nothing. No practical value whatsoever. There are multiple papers now that say giving 2 doses, 3 doses more is a waste of time. It will not work. In fact, it is just putting a band-aid on an amputation. It is an utter disaster. But it's all they've got. This is all medicine has to offer. Double the dose. Call me in the morning. Double the dose doesn't work. It just makes the situation worse. So vaccination has made measles a more dangerous disease. And I could give you the same lecture for mumps or rubella or chickenpox or whooping cough. But there are winners. How extraordinary is it that a product that doesn't work is a massive commercial success precisely because it doesn't work? The volume of sales of MMR vaccine have skyrocketed because of booster vaccination policies, mandatory vaccination, forced vaccination upon people who've had multiple doses of this vaccine, and they're needing those precisely because it doesn't work. And this is the problem. When you take a product, when you take a company out of the free market, when you remove competition, when you remove the imperative to make a product better and better and better and safer and safer and safer, and you give it liability protection, and you mandate the market, then this is the consequence. Merck's profits grow. There is no incentive for Merck to make a better vaccine. None whatsoever. Because their sales are going through the roof as a consequence of their vaccine failure. Mutants. I want to be very brief on this. The way in which we make vaccines actually encourages the selection of mutants. Again, this is how naive we've been. Vaccination, immunology, balance in our immune system against infection is essential. There are 2 elements to the immune system, very, very simply. One is antibodies that mop up the virus in the bloodstream before it gets into cells. The virus has to get into the cell to reproduce itself. It can't do that without getting into the human cell. So measles, when we get it and it's in the bloodstream or in the secretions, can be picked on by antibodies and neutralized. But once it gets into cells, it needs cell-mediated immunity, killer cells, to go and destroy those virally infected cells. So there are these 2 key components, outside the cell and inside the cell. And you need a balance, like everything in life. And the clinical representation of the killer response, the virus being killed in cells, is the measles rash. That is a good thing. That's the beginning of healing. That's when the immune cells of the body are now destroying virally infected cells and producing this inflammatory response. That's what you need to see. That is the beginning of the healing phase of measles. But when you make a vaccine, what you don't want to see is the rash, because that's considered to be an adverse reaction. So you create a vaccine that produces high levels of antibody, but no rash. So you're disturbing that balance away from adequate cellular immunity. You're doing something different to what nature has done. So you select a vaccine that produces high antibody levels and no rash. And you're doing exactly the wrong thing. And when you do that, we know from experience with other viruses, like hepatitis C, that you are putting a selection pressure on the virus to produce escape mutants, viruses that are no longer susceptible to the immunity produced by the vaccine. And then we have a virgin soil population, a mutant that eludes the immune response to the vaccine, so that we have effectively a virgin soil. Are we sitting on a time bomb? So are these fears merited? The other part of this is, has vaccination driven the evolution of measles towards new mutant strains of the virus that are not susceptible to our immunity? Certainly to the immunity produced by the vaccine, and the answer is yes. And the reason for repeating this talk is all of this has emerged in a relatively short space of time. This is a paper showing the emergence of what are called D4 subgenotypes or mutants of measles virus, which are increasingly less susceptible to the neutralization from the vaccine. And these have emerged in countries like France and the UK, and doubtless the US as well, and there are similar D3 mutants, which describes an element of the genetic code of the virus, that have emerged under genetic selection pressure in countries that have intensively vaccinated, but have not emerged in countries like East Africa, where they've only vaccinated much more recently. So it appears that just like antibiotics, our policy of vaccination intensively has driven the emergence of these resistant strains of measles virus against which we appear to be no longer protected. So universal measles vaccination was founded on a set of false premises and promises that have resulted in the destruction of natural herd immunity, that extraordinary effect that I showed you, that is now gone. A hazardous shift in the age of susceptibility to younger age groups, to babies and to adults who are more susceptible to an adverse outcome. You'll remember there was that Italian air hostess who died from measles recently in the news. The blame was put on you. But she'd been vaccinated. She'd been vaccinated as a child, and she was probably told, her mother was told, this is one vaccine for life, your child is now protected. But she wasn't. And she got measles as an adult when she was more susceptible to an adverse outcome, and she died. And the blame was put on you. But it wasn't. The blame should be on those who made these false promises in the beginning, who told her mother that once you've had this vaccine, your child is protected, because she wasn't. You see how perverse the argument has become. That we've now got atypical and what are called highly transmissible measles in vaccinees, the emergence of resistant strains in a world of what I've called acquired immune virginity, and complex and severe adverse reactions such as autism, which I believe to be a direct responsibility, direct consequence of these vaccines. Here's another example that I talked about earlier. Whooping cough emergence was blamed on you, and then it was found that it only selectively occurred in those who'd been vaccinated, and the unvaccinated were perfectly healthy. Resurgence of whooping cough may owe to vaccines' inability to prevent infections. And this bold admission, and I wonder what this doctor's doing now for a living, maybe making films. Pertussis is back because we didn't completely understand how our immune defenses against whooping cough worked. We layered assumptions upon assumptions and now find ourselves in the uncomfortable position of admitting that we may have made some crucial errors. The fault is not yours. The fault is upon those who layered assumptions upon assumptions. It is the vanity, the extraordinary vanity of man. And nature will haunt the high ceilings of our ambition. Nature will prevail. Nature is geared up to prevail, to persist, to mutate, to change, to adapt, but above all to survive. And it will do that. It was a wonderful scene, I don't remember, in Jurassic Park, the original Jurassic Park, when they're in the laboratory. And Sam Mendes picks up or looks at this egg, and there's a velociraptor hatching, and he says, "Oh my God, you've bred a velociraptor." And the Japanese scientist in the white coat, the man in the white coat, says, "Don't worry, they're all female they can't reproduce. And Jeff Goldblum steps in, the chaos theory mathematician, and he says, you don't understand. Nature will find a way. And of course, nature found a way. A lot of people got eaten. But nature will find a way, and you must trust and believe in that. Nature will find a way. If I was to offer you a single piece of advice, I was talking about it with a mother back there just earlier. One of the most powerful influences that you have, one of the most powerful forces you have available to you is maternal instinct. And you must trust that. You must trust that. That little voice inside you that says, this is right or this is wrong, you listen to that voice. Okay? It's there for a reason. It's there for a reason. It's been there for millions and millions and millions of years. And the reason we're here on this earth is because of that voice. Not because of public health or doctors. So you listen to that voice and you listen to nothing else. Okay? Because that is the voice that's going to tell you to research this. To do your own homework. Because the information is all available. Not to buy into the lies or the rhetoric of the public health authorities who own the media, who've controlled the media through the pharmaceutical industry. But do your own research and to understand yourselves. But trust that instinct. So important. And that is the essence of the new film that's being made at the moment. Vax 2 comes out. That's not my film. That comes out next week. I'm in that film, but I didn't make it. My new film comes out in April of next year and is a story, the real story, the true story behind the 1986 National Childhood Vaccine Injury Act. And it is coming out in terms of timing when it can have most impact upon the next presidential election. And health freedom in that election, in the consideration of people's votes, needs to be front and center. I've written a paper about this story. It's called The Sixth Extinction, a happy title. Vaccine immunity and measles mutants in a virgin soil, and this paper is available from the American College of Physicians and Surgeons. I haven't written a scientific paper for some time. I wonder why, at least not one that's been published, but there it is. And there he is. Sooner or later, we all sit down to a banquet of consequences. Robert Louis Stevenson. Thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you, guys. Thank you. One question? Yeah. Thank you very much. I appreciate it.